Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. May I have your attention, please? Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us all throughout today. I hope you had a refreshing coffee break and you are ready for our last session for today. My name is Lien Agabi. I'm a member of the organizing committee, and I will be the moderator for this session. Globally, future-oriented discussions are concerned with climate change, sustainable planning, artificial intelligence, digital technologies and economies, and social innovation. In the region, however, these topics are often considered irrelevant as they drown in economic decline and political conflict. Nevertheless, such global transformations have profound consequences on the region. And contrary to dominant beliefs, our region is rich with creative capacities ready to contribute to global issues. Our multidisciplinary panel today will bring cutting-edge research and development in conversation with the region's concerns. In particular, we will unpack how artificial intelligence can enable governments to design effective public policies, streamline decision-making, and enhance citizens' engagements. We will also explore how digital technologies can be used to investigate human rights violations and empower civil society. We will also touch upon the future of culture and the potential of social innovation to positively impact communities through arts, culture, and thought leadership. We will also discuss the prospects for alternative energy in the region as climate change intensifies. Geared towards the future, this panel will help us imagine a future beyond boundaries, one that transcends the limitations imposed on the region and its people. Our panel will start with a keynote speech by Rania Sukkar. Rania is the Senior Vice President for the QuickBooks Money Portfolio, including small business payments, banking, and lending. She and her team have launched several game-changing offerings for small businesses over the past few years. These include QuickBooks Capital, which expands access to capital to early-stage businesses, Cash Flow Planner, which gives small businesses visibility into their cash flow 90 days into the future, and QuickBooks Cash, which provides an all-digital, no-fee bank account that offers instant money movement capabilities. Given her Syrian heritage, Rania has been deeply involved in creating opportunities for youth in the Arab world. Most recently, Rania co-founded Jusur, Bridges in Arabic, a global non-profit organization focused on investing in Syria's youth for a brighter tomorrow. To date, the organization has helped educate nearly 1,000 young people who otherwise would not have been able to continue their education if it was not for Jusur. Please help me give a warm welcome to Rania Sukkar.
Thank you, Lien, for that introduction. It is a true privilege and honor to be with all of you here today, talking about a region that is so dear to my heart and to be engaging with so many people who are so passionate about changing our region's trajectory and future. And this panel in particular that we're about to have, this next session of the conference, is one that I could not be more excited about, engaging the region's future, or engaging the future for our region. What I'd love to do is start by sharing a little bit more with you about why I'm so passionate about playing a role in paving the way for a brighter future for our region, and in particular for closing the opportunity gap that exists in our region. So my parents were born in Syria and immigrated to the United States, as so many families have done over time. And my 3 siblings and I were born in the US and would spend our summers in Damascus with our cousins, an experience that maybe many of you have had in this audience. So many amazing memories from that time, whether it was tarnib late into the nights, to the point where my uncle had to shut off the lights and kick us out, or the falafel runs to the amazing falafel shop with the khibz frangi, and you can almost imagine the taste of that as you describe it. What I experienced, though, in going to Damascus all those summers is as I got older, our experiences between what my cousins had and what we had started to diverge in a massive way. Our dreams got bigger and bigger. I would dream of where I would go to university, the impact I wanted to have in my life, what career choices I would make, and theirs got smaller and smaller as they started to move past the age of 12. I found my male cousins no longer going to university because they discovered that there was no benefit of going to university. Ultimately, they each would take their father's business and cut it in four, so the family business would become split by four, so why continue to university? And the girls had even worse choices. At the age of 16, they were often married, having children, and through that experience, I realized the power of hope and the power of dreaming. And I wanted so badly to be able to give that to the young people in the Arab world. And so that is why I've been very focused on trying to create those opportunities. Now, that was 25 years ago. The conditions, as we've been speaking about today, as we've heard throughout the day, have gotten, as many of you have lived, have gotten dramatically worse. The last decade, for sure, the last few years in a place like Lebanon with the financial crisis. We've seen in Syria more than 12 million people displaced from their homes, 7 million people living as refugees in countries around the world with very few rights, and we just heard about this, more than 50% of the refugee population that is school-aged out of school. In Lebanon, in just the last few years, the currency has devalued by 90%. GDP contracted by a quarter in 2020, and by 15% last year. And more than half the families in Lebanon are now below the poverty line. So the situation that I grew up with that motivated me in an incredible way is now dramatically worse than even what it was 25 years ago, which means we have a responsibility to our region. We must work together to bring about a better future. And I believe so much in the possibility of individual initiative to create positive change. And I've had the opportunity to see that reinforced time and time again, but most notably through the experience several colleagues and I have had in founding Jusur. I'd like to take a few minutes to share that with you before talking about how some of the technology trends we're seeing around the globe can help the region. But I'd love to start here with the experience of Jusur, because one of the things I'm hoping to motivate you all by through this discussion is a sense that you can drive positive change at scale for the people of our region. So Jusur. It's an organization that several friends and I founded a decade ago. And it's all been focused on education. As Lean said, the mission is to invest in Syria's youth for a brighter tomorrow, to work towards ensuring Syria does not face an education gap and a lost generation. And over the course of the last decade, we've actually helped 10,000 people. I think I need to update my bio because there was a typo. It said 1,000. 10,000 people have benefited from our programs. So just to share a little bit about that, nearly 7,000 children in Lebanon have gone through Jusur's primary education program, Learning to Read and Write, and that's a program where we've also helped teachers and educated teachers. Nearly 700 individuals have received a scholarship from one of Jusur's programs, including a couple in this room, and several thousand have benefited from our entrepreneurship development programs. So that's 10,000 people whose lives have changed based on a couple of individuals who had an idea and have been able to deploy over $15 million towards this cause. Highly efficient, because it's run almost like a private sector organization. But that's just the direct benefit. What's amazing about an organization like Jusur is the indirect benefit, because the individuals we support are individuals who all have not only the capacity, but the determination to drive positive change for others. We call this the multiplier effect. So the students we've educated in university have gone on to help hundreds and thousands of others beyond themselves. They've formed organizations that have mentored and tutored other young people, helping them get into university, creating scholarships. They've gone on to organizations like the World Bank and invested in policy, development, and deployment of these programs in the Arab world. And they've gone on to take roles in the private sector, which then influence their companies to think differently about the Arab world. So I wanted to share this example with you, to share an example of how even individual grassroots initiative can create positive change for our region. We don't need to just wait for governments to change or foreign governments to change. We ourselves can make a difference. So with that in mind, I'd love to now turn to a couple of sectors that I believe are going to be incredibly important to shepherd a more positive future for our region: education and financial services. And I chose these two sectors for a few reasons. One, they're two sectors that I know about because I work in them. In education, I've had the opportunity to dabble in through Jusur. And financial services, I work in full-time. I lead a fintech team with Intuit, a global company that builds fintech solutions for small businesses. And so I spend my day and night thinking about fintech and what it can do to serve the underserved and create better opportunities. More importantly, I chose these two sectors because they're foundational to the region's growth. We cannot achieve anything if our population is uneducated. And frankly, we will be very limited in what we can do if we do not have a vibrant, high-performing financial services sector. So that's the reason for these two. Now, most of what I'll talk about will be related to Syria and to Lebanon. These are the two countries I know more about. The four countries we're talking about today are so different in their opportunities, different in their challenges, that there's no way to talk about them thematically as one country. So just sharing that as I go forward. So let's start with education. To the extent any of you are intending to find a way to play a massive role in the region's future, this is the first sector I would look at. We must find a way to make sure all of our children in the region achieve a primary education and that we achieve high levels of advanced education, whether that's a university degree or vocational skills. We cannot let our region achieve or realize the fate and the trajectory that we're on today, which is vast amounts of children not learning to read and write, not completing their primary education, and very low attainment of university education. So that is, I believe, the most important sector for us to put our collective efforts towards and to not let our children and our youth down. The area in education I'd love to spend time on with all of you as a thought provocation is around job creation. Because there has to be an incentive for young people to continue their education. You take someone who's near high school, even someone in middle school grade, and unless there's a payoff to education, unless there's a reason for them to stay in school, they will leave. And so I'd love to see more innovation on the job creation space. And I'm not very hopeful that's going to come from the governments anytime soon. It's hard to create jobs. It's hard to stimulate the economy. So what can we do as third-party actors to help stimulate jobs in these economies to create incentive for people to continue studying? I always take inspiration, and I'll start here and then I'll talk about jobs we can create in the local economies, but I always take inspiration from organizations that are able to create jobs in local economies in developed markets. So, as the way Andela talks about it, one of the organizations I'll talk about, it's about connecting brilliance to opportunity. I'd love to see more of this in our region, and I'd love to share a couple of examples of where it's been successful and what it'll take for this type of work to be successful in our region and the challenges that have historically held us back. A couple of organizations I really look up to: Samasource, that's done work in East Africa, and Andela, I just mentioned, also historically focused in Africa but moving more broadly. Udacity, that's done a lot of very impressive work in our region, and even a platform like Upwork that's more global. These platforms have to solve challenges across multiple layers. They need to first go out and create opportunities and jobs in developed markets that are looking for talent around the world. And for people who are in highly competitive markets, I live and work in Silicon Valley, and the fight for talent is intense. If you are a job seeker right now in one of those markets, you're in a great spot. So the first part of this is going out and finding companies like that who have a strong demand for talent and can't find it in their local markets, and helping talk about the nature of the talent in a region like the Arab world. The second thing these organizations do is they create matchmaking platforms. You need to match the supply of talent, labor, with the need. And then third, they work on skilling the labor in these markets. So not only is it helping them transition from what they might have learned in university, some of the softer skills, but also sometimes it's the actual job training itself and the skill training. So let me tell you a little bit about Samasource and Andela, what they've done, and then let's talk about our region. So Samasource focuses in East Africa on skilling labor and then helping them find the jobs in the developed world. They've been able to raise over close to $100 million in funding, and they've created 56,000 jobs for young people in Africa that are focused mostly on data categorization, so that can then go into ML models and AI models that then support the developed countries. So sometimes it's just labeling activities and things along those lines. But 56,000 skilled jobs in these markets where they're training and giving people dignity through work. Andela is another example. They started in Africa, but now they've raised $320 million from funders around the world, so there's a lot of money in these spaces for any excited entrepreneurs that want to get into it. And they're creating a platform. They're taking what they've learned in Africa, and they're expanding it to the world and building on the idea of remote work that's now emerging. And they're helping create a platform that can create teams of workers, engineers, who then can be employed by top companies around the world. So they're taking the idea of what they learned in Africa, and they're broadening it. Udacity is a great example of a platform that's had success in our region. In the case of Udacity, they've done, many of you probably know them very well, they've trained young people in coding skills, whether it's on mobile phones or web coding, and they've helped them find gig work in many cases. And they've been successful in places like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the UAE in helping on the gig worker side. There have been limitations in achieving things like actually getting technology companies to relocate to our region to offer full-time work, which is the end goal. Everybody would like full-time stable work rather than gig work. But they're making progress towards the direction of helping young people get high-impact jobs and keep them in the countries rather than needing to move abroad for opportunities. So in our region, what's it going to take to do something like this? Why hasn't it happened yet? There's obviously cases of people who are doing gig work sitting in places like Lebanon and Syria, but it's limited. What do we do to make this happen at scale? Entrepreneurs in this space need to solve many more problems than these other companies had. First, they need to ensure that there's stable electricity and wireless for young people who want to code and work in these markets. They need to solve the problem of the instability of the workers' lives themselves. You know, one day, if you're a refugee in Lebanon, a Syrian refugee, you may ultimately need to go home. And so suddenly there's that instability, and they need to provide stability to the employers in the developed world. They also need to solve for payments. How do you pay these people? The payment system, and I'll talk about that in a second, is much less developed in places like Lebanon and Syria, so you need to solve that problem as well. And then finally, you need to solve the branding opportunity. When people look for gig workers or to employ full-time workers, they want the brand reputation of when I hire a Syrian or a Lebanese, they're known for being phenomenal when it comes to tech and coding and that type of skill. And so we need to build that up as well as part of the solving this at scale. So this is one of many ways I believe we can create more opportunity in education. We also need to think, and I'll only touch on this briefly, besides creating this type of job, we also need to think about how the local economy can create jobs, because you'll never create enough jobs through international markets. It needs to be local too. And again, everything I think about doesn't relate to the government, because I think we need to innovate before the government is innovating, and in the absence of it, we all need to be innovating and finding solutions. And so I thought of a couple to highlight to all of you. One is just to lean into self-employment and create more credit, and I'll talk about that in a second, and more skill training for individuals who get a basic education and want to go be self-employed, whether it's in the grocery sector or in the manufacturing sector. To the extent we can skill them and give them the credit that they need, then they have a reason to continue their education because there's a payoff to it. The only other one I want to touch on is teachers. I've learned through Jasur the power of training teachers. And so it's a job category I'd love us to create more of, and I'll talk about that. So in Jasur, what I've learned is when you give aid to create jobs for teachers, it has multiple levels of impact to the economy. You educate a classroom of children, which is tremendous. That money gets pumped back into the local economy, because often those teachers desperately need the income as well, and so it affects the entire community. And then you train individuals who will become critical to avoiding brain drain in the future of our countries. And so I'd love us to create a campaign to fund tens of thousands of teachers, let's say in Lebanon and Syria, find a way to solve the corruption problem we just talked about, where you could fund the money and give it to ministries and ensure that it's actually going to be deployed in the right way as intended, and also to support the private sector through private teacher training. But it's just one job category. Again, this broader theme of creating jobs to create incentive for people to go to school, that then creates a reason for people to continue their education and creates the payoff, which will solve one of the many challenges to solving our education problem. As all of you involved in the education space know, there's so many things we need to solve. We need to make remote learning more effective. We need to help with the psychosocial support at scale. There are so many things we're going to need to do to improve education outcomes for young children in Syria and increasingly Lebanon. But these are just some ideas of important interventions that we can have to improve the sector. So that's education. I'd love to turn to financial services. Financial services, as I mentioned, are so critical for a country's development. You need a great payment system that makes it frictionless and low cost to pay people. You need a way where you can offer credit to people in need to help fuel the economy. You need safety and security in storage of people's money so they feel confident and secure and they're not hiding money under their mattress. So we need to solve all of these things. Historically, the Arab world, and particularly our region, has been low when it comes to measuring the financial services penetration compared to other regions. And it's become far worse as a result of the financial crisis in Lebanon. But if you look just a few years ago to a study that the Gates Foundation did, they found that in Lebanon, less than 50%, I think the figure was 45%, of people had access to financial services, meaning they had a bank account. It was a similar percentage in Jordan. And in Syria, a decade ago, even before the crisis, the percentage was 25%. The implication of not having a bank account is that you're operating entirely in cash, which means there's tons of friction in any sort of commerce transaction you're doing or in even getting paid. It means you don't have access to credit. And it means your livelihood is just much more limited in terms of the possibilities and what you can do. Of course, the financial crisis in Lebanon made this dramatically worse with the complete loss of faith and confidence in the banking sector, where people will really struggle to gain faith again in putting their deposits back into the Lebanese banking system. And so that will yield many years of challenges for the economy. So as somebody just shared the saying in Arabic, and I think about all the time, constraint leads to creativity. And so there is, when you have a situation where financial services innovation is so needed in our region, there are tremendous opportunities for innovation. And so this is a region not only where I believe we can take some of the best financial technology trends that we're seeing around the world and apply them, but it could also be an area where the region can lead the way. Now, there are some massive hurdles that I'll talk about in a second, so none of this will be easy. But given we have some of the biggest financial services and sector challenges in the world, maybe this can be a region we can lead the way in innovation around. Now, in fintech globally, there are amazing trends happening, and I live these daily. But there is just an emergence of new innovation. On the lending and credit side, new data available to all sorts of private sector lenders is leading to an explosion in opportunities to give high quality access to capital. You've got just more data available that you never had before as a traditional lender, where you can automatically assess the creditworthiness of a consumer or a small business or a large enterprise and give out a loan at a much lower cost, which helps give access to capital to people who've never been able to access it. We're seeing tremendous innovation in payments. What used to cost a ton of money and a ton of friction to move money internationally cross-border is now, there's many more opportunities where it's very fast and very low cost. And in this space of payments, we're seeing in banking, we're seeing an explosion of competition through banking as a service initiatives and also open banking initiatives. This basically allows many new entrants into the banking sector to do things like taking fees out of opening bank accounts. Historically, many people have been underbanked because they didn't want to pay the high fees from a traditional bank account. And with entrance into the market, you're seeing tons and tons of innovation. So how might we apply these trends to our region? A couple of provocations. My first thought for all of us is, what could we do with the crypto sector in Lebanon as a starting point and in Syria? Now, crypto has a lot of work from an innovation perspective, and there are not many use cases that have yet emerged that are working to create tremendous benefit and prosperity around the world. It's still today very much a security that's being traded in the case of Bitcoin, and we're just seeing early days of opportunity and use cases being applied. But I believe in the theory of crypto and what it could do for our region. So this is all about decentralized finance, where your monetary value is in tokens that sits on the blockchain, so you don't have to rely on a local bank for that value to be stored and used. Now, let's talk about how this could work in a place like Lebanon. What if we moved, and Syria, what if we moved to a position where people would use cryptocurrency as a store of value and for transactions? Now, there are many cryptocurrencies that can be applied here. It could be Bitcoin. I personally believe we need more of a stable coin for commerce and transaction that is tied to a currency rather than one whose value fluctuates dramatically in markets. It could also be a stable coin tied to the US dollar. It could be a basket of stable coins. There will be many cryptocurrencies that emerge over time that could be used, but let's imagine cryptocurrency for the market. You'd have to ensure that you had widespread enough adoption of it for it to be a valuable currency in the market. So if today only 0.5% of transactions can occur in cryptocurrency because merchants don't accept it, people are going to need to keep converting back to fiat currency. And you have all the problems that exist today in the financial system. So whoever gets involved in this space is going to need to innovate to get it into the hands of a lot of people, to make it dead simple, to focus on the education components. You also are going to need to build a robust risk infrastructure around this. Anyone who works in the financial services sector knows that you need a ton of data signals to help inform fraud, to protect citizens, to make sure that whatever's held in their wallet is protected for them, and identity, because money can only move if you can validate the identity of who it's moving to. And so we in the region would have to build those supporting risk capabilities to enable that. And then you'll need things like ATMs in the market that can convert fiat to cryptocurrency, as opposed to what's happening now with dealers running around, grabbing cash and trying to buy cryptocurrency in international markets on behalf of people. So there's a lot of work that would have to do to make this viable, and there's a lot to be figured out. We've seen in markets like El Salvador that have been early adopters, they certainly haven't cracked it. But it's an area that you can imagine, given the pain in our market, we can almost imagine that there's a possibility for us to lead the way in solving some of these problems. That's the first area. In lending, I'd love to see what we've seen in other emerging markets where you get different data provided, the ability to gather tons of new data, new sources of data to be able to lend credit, offer credit, extend credit in ways that are efficient and cost effective. So how do you create these apps that are serving some other purpose where you embed finance in those apps and are able to extend credit effectively? We've seen it in places like Southeast Asia with Grab, which started as a transportation solution like Uber and added to it delivery of food. And suddenly they have so much data on consumers, and they have been able to add consumer finance to it so they can extend capital and be a store of value for consumers and offer some of that. In my world, in the QuickBooks world and in Intuit, we provide small business software, small business accounting software. And so we see every transaction about a small business's income and earnings, and we can use that to constantly be underwriting those small businesses and extending credit in a way that banks historically have not been able to do profitably. So how can we find ways to drive benefit through these other sectors that produce data and then layer lending on top of that? And then finally, in banking, how do we see some of the innovation we've seen in other sectors, in the banking sector, where we start to get competition in our region? This is going to be harder if we're going to get open banking, where banks offer their data through APIs to any third party in the fintech space, or banking as a service, where banks are willing to take their capabilities and enable fintechs to offer store of value accounts. It's going to take work because you need policymakers to change, you need industry participants to change to make that happen. But there's promising signals coming from outside of the region we're talking about today in the broader Arab world. If you look at Egypt, if you look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, if you look at what's happening in the UAE, these are markets where the regulators have started to declare they want open banking. They want their markets to advance and accelerate at the speed and pace of other markets. And a lot of that has happened through the lobbying of entrepreneurs and private sectors who've spent time with regulators to help them understand the possibilities and potential. So how might we benefit from the trend around us in the broader Arab world to encourage our own regulators and industry participants to move in this direction? So there's a lot of possibilities. It doesn't mean any of this will be easy. Our region is a particularly difficult one to move. We heard about all the challenges in the panel before this one, with corruption, with entrenched interests, with global forces that are influencing the region's direction, with brain drain, with lack of education. It won't be easy. But I hope all of you, I know all of you, are unbelievably motivated and unbelievably talented. And together we'll find a way to break through some of these things. And hopefully these just give you a couple of ideas of sectors and subsectors where innovation can really help bring about a better future for our region. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania, for such an insightful speech. And I think you really shed light on important areas to make us all think about the future of our region and areas where education can create opportunity, whether it's innovation and fintech, so whether it's cryptocurrency. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Saïd.
We have a couple of questions for you. So first we'll start with the first question. Can you reflect on the future skills needed for the future job market?
Yes. So many skills. I'm just trying to relate it back to the Arab world and what it needs. The one thing that I think is very positive about what's happening in the Arab world today is this tenacity and determination I see in youth. So the great news is we have a skill that's out there that's forming as a result very much of the Arab Spring and what youth has gone through. We heard a ton about it in the previous panel, but I see it every day in interacting with young people through Jasur. So we definitely need that, and I would encourage it. Other skills that we need an open-mindedness to learning new things. I say that, I believe that the more diverse experience somebody has, the more they look at the world in diverse ways, in multidisciplinary ways, and the more they can be rapid learners because the world is changing so quickly. So I always encourage people to try to have multiple types of experience because that will make them more effective in whatever job they pursue. I think the other work that's required is, skills in data and data science and the importance of that. It's very important not to shy away from those type of skills, but to lean into them and embrace them. Certainly technology and coding, we need a ton of that, and there's so much possibility with software and hardware that we can lean into in the region. And then influencing skills. Nothing is going, you need that in any private sector organization. You certainly need it when you've got many actors in the Arab world that you need to influence and drive change for. So I would say that. And then the last I'll say is creativity and tenacity. Nothing is going to be easy in the Arab world. And you just have to keep going at it. And you need a little bit of naivete to believe that things are possible, even when people tell you there's no way there's possible. Because if you spend a lot of time with people in the Arab world, they will tell you, because they live in it. It's so depressing. And you just need to believe be optimistic, and just almost close it all out and just believe you can drive change. And so those are the skills I think that are necessary, both for private sector type of work for our region as well as entrepreneurs.
Amazing. We have another question. Don't you think that focusing on primary education is a limited, unsustainable solution? Isn't now the time to put secondary education on the spot, as we have seen consequences of the provision of only primary education?
It's a great question. I believe both are critical. I'll start there, but for different reasons. And there's something really important in that question, which is primary is almost easier to do, and it's where most people have started. And in our Jusur world, as many people in the audience, I see Hani and I see Grace, who we've worked with over time to figure this out. Secondary is a lot harder because you have to do what I was talking about. You have to create incentives for people to want to stay in school, so there's a payoff. And so people have shied away from that. We started with primary school because we found it so much harder to create jobs for people in secondary and high school, secondary and tertiary education to continue. That said, it's incredibly important to focus on that group because, number one, they're closer to graduating and achieving, so you have a higher likelihood of success. They've already made it this far. Getting them through the other side with a baccalaureate degree is incredibly important. That said, we also cannot forget the young people. If they don't learn to read and write and the basic ability to hold a pen and the discipline of being in a classroom and a productive member of society and helping them address the trauma that they've experienced as a result of their experience as a young person, we will truly have a lost generation. And so the answer is we have to work on both ends of the spectrum, which is tough because we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but they're both critical.
Great. One more question. Many Syrian higher education scholarship programs have very low percentage of their accepted students coming from Idlib and other opposition-held areas, including historically marginalized governorates currently controlled by the SDF. Why do you think that's the case, and what are the steps to overcome these access challenges?
There are a lot of access challenges in many parts of these countries. We realize it's easier. It's often easier for us to find a student in Lebanon than it is in Syria, for example, because they might have had more opportunities to achieve when they left Syria. In refugee camps, we find it harder to support students in those because they have so few opportunities. They're dealing with challenges. So in many of these places, and possibly including Idlib, I'm not as close to it, but it makes sense. It's harder to see that impact. We need to address it the way we address every underrepresented group in developed markets. I'm sure it's the same in the UK, but in the US right now, we are focusing hard on hiring people in a very intense way from underrepresented communities. And previously was the focus on hiring women and creating opportunities. And I have watched how a systematic focus can make a difference. And so in Jusur, for example, we're increasingly trying to get into refugee camps, offer programs earlier in the tenure of children and youth to help them get there. And we need to do that in some of these other areas that are experiencing different conditions.
Okay, we have room for just one more question before we wrap up. When it comes to education, how do you think about creating sustainable change that lasts after external funding or programs cease to exist?
For the individual, I really come back to the multiplier effect. I think for the individual, you want to invest in people who are working to give back in tremendous ways. You want every dollar of education to go as far as possible. And so we think about, there are so many young people from these countries who are so determined. I met several of you today where I was blown away by your stories. You have achieved so much more than somebody who had access to so many things in their lives could have achieved. And if we fund more of these people who have a personal determination to change the course of the Arab world, that will create sustaining power and sustaining support where we won't need as much external support. We will be able to do it ourselves. And so we just need to stay committed and continue to invest in people who are determined to give back and do more than they've been given.
Thank you so much, Rania. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you as the keynote speaker of our panel. Can you all give a round of applause for Rania?
Thank you. Okay.
Can I invite our panelists to please join me on stage? Could we please show the poll question answers? We have quite a diverse panel with us here today. We have Dr. Amr Najjar, who is a senior researcher on explainable AI and AI ethics at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology. He is also a visiting researcher at the University of Luxembourg. He's been an active researcher since 2010 with more than 50 peer-reviewed publications on AI ethics, user-centric AI, and transparent AI. I also have with me Omar Farwati, who is a researcher with forensic architecture, an agency based at Goldsmiths University of London, which applies pioneering spatial analysis techniques for human rights investigations. I also have with me Jessica Obaid, who's a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute and a senior advisor at Azuri Strategy. She's an independent energy consultant, and she possesses a unique asset of combining technical and policy expertise and has advised a wide range of entities across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And last but not least, I have Valentina Qassisieh, who is the CEO of Abdelhamid Shuman Foundation, a social activist with a focus on community empowerment and cultural inclusion. Welcome, everyone. So I guess we can start with a question to you, Amr. I think we cannot talk about the future without talking about artificial intelligence. And you have done extensive research about the topic. So maybe we can start by setting the stage and demystifying. What is AI?
Okay, I'd be happy to do. I just have my slides.
Yes.
This was the tough decision of the day, should I do slides or not? But in my domain, we tend to have slides, so habits tend to prevail. So what is AI? Demystifying AI. AI, artificial intelligence, aims to reproduce human intelligence in a machine. And this machine is typically a computer. So the official launch of this domain actually started in 1956. There's a conference. It's called the Dartmouth Conference. We consider this conference is the founding moment of AI. These are the main chaps that really contributed to the emergence of the domain: Marvin Minsky, John McCarthy, and this kind of people. And since the outset of this domain, it has been split. It's like you have two sects. One thinks that the goal is to replicate the structure of the human mind by creating artificial neurons, like the same neurons we have in our minds. And thus, you can actually make the machine be able to perceive things, like, for instance, recognize objects, recognize activities, recognize the users. This is group one. And group two, they more focus on logic, reasoning, deduction, and abduction, and the cognitive capacities, because they consider this as intelligence. Intelligence is not only perception. And since then, you know, like some kind of a war and peace is going among the two groups. So why do we need demystification? Well, first, because AI is fluctuating all the time. And here I'm using a term we have in the community. We call it AI winter. And that's why I put this photo of robots sitting alone in winter, in the cold. So what is an AI winter? In reality, it happens for the first time in the 1970s, where we started to consider, people started to consider that AI perhaps might be useless. So let's cut funds, and let's stop investment, and let's find something more profitable. Maybe you go to oil or to ExxonMobil, put the money there, because oil was booming at the time, and so people forgot about AI for a while. But what is happening now, I mean, after this winter, of course, we had other summers and winters. But the thing now is that since 2010, we are in one of the sunniest and most prosperous AI summers. We have lots of money. We have lots of universities. We have institutes are being opened everywhere, and everyone is talking about AI. And if you look at the top 5 companies by market cap, 4 out of them are actually directly related to AI, like Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Amazon. The only one that is not AI is Saudi Aramco. So this money and this lots of investment has created the hype. So people are treating AI specialists and AI itself as if it was a type of magic or alchemist in the medieval time. AI can do everything, and sometimes it's like diabolized, and people think that AI is going to take their jobs, and all this kind of problems. And this is especially in regions like ours, where you have less public debate. In this public debate, you have academics who are underrepresented. You have less money spent on knowledge dissemination and on vulgarization of knowledge. So this creates more and more, biases towards AI and prejudice. So in this context, I think, and the community thinks, that demystifying AI, globally speaking, but also in our region, is a must to pursue in any AI development strategy. And again, this slide is of particular importance because AI is, in addition to the hype, AI itself is experiencing a very crucial moment, because AI now is getting more and more into sensitive applications. Like, for instance, AI can now decide who can get a loan or not, decide who can get the next heart transplant or liver transplant or not, and decide, for instance, where the police should go and patrol or not. So very sensitive applications. I here put a photo of an application that has been proposed by a Chinese researcher, and it had generated lots of controversy in the domain, in the community. This is like physiognomy. This application claims that it can detect criminals from their facial traits. It's just like Cesare Lombroso and the criminology literature in the early 900s. It can detect, for instance, a criminal from the shape of their nose. So they can detect criminals before criminals know that they are criminals. Which means, and that's why we are now living this turn, it means that people started to be aware that we need not a pure technical approach to AI. We need an ethical, societal, and legal approach to AI. And this is ESL, especially in this kind of applications, or killer robots or autonomous weapons. And this is where our region should play some role, because researchers have discovered that in this ethical, legal, and societal turn of AI is region and culture dependent. And this is a very famous paper from MIT, actually co-authored by 2 Syrians. So there are plenty of researchers, but 2 of them are Syrians. It shows that, for instance, the attitude of smart vehicle around the world. So I think something like 47 million people participated in the experiment. 47 million. It shows that the attitude of people towards smart vehicle or what a smart car can do is region dependent and culture dependent. So it shows that you cannot just create one solution somewhere and just generalize it everywhere. So we are living this turn now. Still, our region, especially Syria and Lebanon, I'm talking about Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. They cannot respond enough adequately because of lots of challenges. Maybe we can come later back to this point. And I think that's all for me. Thank you.
I think so. Thank you so much, Amr. I think an important thing that you mentioned is that AI is basically sensitive to regions and to cultures. And I think globally, the growing applications of artificial intelligence are triggering numerous opportunities, but also challenges, specifically for governments. So can you give us some examples of how artificial intelligence is used in governance in our region specifically?
Yeah, most of the best examples will come from the Gulf region. For instance, you will have e-governance. You have with AI, for instance, you can develop and test and run smart transport solutions. For instance, you can also, of course, for instance, develop better forecasts of weather, of the market. So this is being used. Also, I think there are examples like this in UAE or in Qatar. Also, they are thinking about the use of AI in agriculture. In Saudi Arabia, even so applications about the use of drones and AI for the Hajj. So there are some applications that are being used. Now, if you come back to Syria, it's mostly about delivery. I mean, there are some things. I saw a Syrian who developed a search engine, but it's not widespread enough because of the conditions of the. I mean, the capacities are there, but it's not widespread enough because of the situation. Even in the COVID, I saw a Syrian who used social networks to distribute equipments for healthcare during the COVID time. So it's there, but if you look at the global picture of these countries, I think there's this AI readiness index. I think it's developed in Oxford, and Syria was out from the study, I think, but both Jordan and Lebanon were below the average. Jordan was better, but Lebanon was way below the average of the AI readiness level. So there are lots so many things to do. Data centers, we can build data centers. There are many things, but this needs policy making. It needs a different outlook.
Thank you, Amr. I think Omar here maybe would disagree with us a little bit, because I think AI has been used extensively from the civil society standpoint. And I think, Omar, maybe you can shed a little bit of light on how digital technologies can empower civil society and build its capacity to demand the future that they so much deserve. I'll give you the clicker.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So I want to begin by first saying that the question about the role of technology in the future of this region must not be about how governments can use it to change how they govern, or how we can consult them on how to do that. The only question we should be asking, at least right now, should be about how it can be used, technology, to empower civil society, and how we can equip people with the tools to demand the future that they want, right? So in doing so, technology like open source media and even 3D modeling, which are already present, can allow them to test the claims of governments, to make their own claims, and therefore allowing them to challenge the monopoly by corporations and states of narrative. Right? So when they have the ability to open the access and the establishment of truth, then we can begin to ask questions about what the future we want is. At Forensic Architecture, which is a research agency in London, we're trying to develop the capacity for civil society to do this by developing methods of open source research, by training people, researchers and activists on the ground, to do this themselves, and by building a collaborative network around the world, and this is an important point that I'll come back to, of civilian investigations. So forensics, as we typically think of it, police forensics, affirms the state power by bringing evidence of crimes of citizens to court, right? So in this case, forensic architecture as an agency is a civilian practice. It's a counter-forensic practice that inverts the forensic gaze and brings evidence of state crimes against their citizens. In places of conflict, like in Syria, or events of extreme violence, we often can't be there or be there as they unfold if we can't access the area. But relatively recently, we've been able to peer into them ourselves from afar, but also have access to what people see, including satellite imagery, but also, as you all know, the flood of social media by people broadcasting everything they see. This is just last week. Shireen Abu Akleh's mourners marching and filming everything that happens around them. And we can use that to investigate the claims being made around those incidents. In the case of the Israeli bombing of Gaza in 2014, we had hundreds and hundreds of videos from just one day. And the challenge here is not just to collect the data, but it's also understanding how to process it, because these images look like chaos, right? Rubble and smoke. But by using techniques of comparing images to one another and using satellite imagery, we can begin to find where they are and place them in one space, in three-dimensional space, to understand them in relation to one another and begin to weave the story that each person sees together. When we have this kind of relationship between images, between evidence, we can begin to take that story and test it against the claims being made by those states and sometimes corporations. In the case of the US bombing of a mosque in Syria in 2017, they claimed with absolute authority, and that's what was reported on, that they had bombed an Al-Qaeda location. People on the ground said it was a mosque. So we had a simple question: what was the use of the building? And we had to look at open source media, reconstruct this space, but importantly, we worked with human rights organizations, journalists, survivors, and first responders from the White Helmets to look at what happened that day. We looked at architectural elements from videos that we'd found online, open source videos, old videos, about things that can begin to tell us what the building was used for. We also commissioned a local photographer to go inside the ruins of the building, what was left of it, somebody living there, to begin to get clues about what was the building used for, right? So when we see evidence of images like shoe racks that are often in mosques, or more distinct architectural elements, like the mihrab, where imams lead the prayer, we can begin to verify the claims being made all along by the citizens that saw it happen. We also worked with the original building's contractor and the survivor of that bombing to reconstruct what was destroyed by the bombing, and understand what was the configuration of the building, again, to verify first the claims being made by those civilians, but also to understand, by working with the first responders, where people were when they pulled them from the rubble, and therefore where they were in the original building. What room were they in? After this investigation, and Human Rights Watch released their own investigation, and Bellingcat, a citizen journalist group, also released an investigation, the US launched their own investigation and found it was indeed a mosque. This is an example of citizens taking back claim of their truths. When Israel killed Ahmed Ariqat 2 years ago at an illegal checkpoint in the West Bank, they claimed he was a terrorist that had intentionally tried to ram into the checkpoint and kill soldiers. Again, they said it with absolute certainty, with absolute authority, and that's how it was reported. Even in the video itself, you can begin to see that it seems that there was an intentionality, a speeding into the checkpoint, and that it hit when it hit the checkpoint. They killed him immediately. So we worked with Al-Haq, a human rights organization in Palestine, and students from a local architecture university to reconstruct the scene. And actually, by looking at it at another angle, we can see that the speed was constant, that the acceleration was negligible. Now, this doesn't answer all the question, but it raises more than enough doubts about the absolute claims that they make, that there should be an investigation. There isn't even an investigation. And his body to this day is being held from his family. They also claimed, and I'm sorry this is a bit disturbing, but it's necessary to understand that when they claim that he charged at them after this, we can see for a fact from the little footage that they released that he was backing away and falling on the ground as he was shot 6 times in 2 seconds. Is that not enough for a civil society to demand an investigation, which still has not been done? In Germany, there was a neo-Nazi killing in which a state agent was present at a cafe of Halit Yozgat. he claimed that he didn't hear anything, see anything, or smell anything. So we reconstructed this, again working with lawyers and his family, a citizens tribunal, to reconstruct the scene and actually simulate the conditions of that room, working with fluid dynamics experts, acoustics experts in the UK. We can reconstruct those conditions and prove that he must have been a witness to this crime. And why is that? Again, no investigation to this day. When there's less evidence, in this case, these are like legal pushbacks along the Greek-Turkish border of migrants seeking asylum. There was little evidence, and when they confiscated their phones, they disposed of them. But by using 3D modeling, we can begin to reconstruct from their memories the conditions and the incidents that they'd lived through. And actually, the modeling begins to enhance their memory. It's not just a representation, it's a research tool. It's something that can trigger your memory and acts as a depository, where every person's truth begins to be verified and abutted into each other's, and we begin to see a more holistic story, something that's sensible. We can see what they saw, where we otherwise couldn't have. When we built a model of the Saïd prison in Syria, there was no images and there was also no sight. So we had to rely on things like sound and smell to reconstruct the spaces, and little they could see to understand what the space was like and reconstruct it for the first time. And the prisoners, again, thinking about the details of the architecture brings out new memories, things that we can corroborate with each other's experiences, something that we can see over and over again. In a different scale, in this platform, we looked at European arms in the bombing of Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition, and we found that what we did for the first time was look at the timeline of airstrikes, all of these potential war crimes, by the way, that we've documented, and worked with human rights researchers and lawyers, civil society researchers on the ground, and journalists to make a correlation, to demonstrate the correlation between public knowledge, the actions of European arms manufacturers, and these airstrikes on that timeline, showing an absolute culpability in these war crimes. War crimes that include, we should say, airstrikes on hospitals and schools. When we looked at the NSO, a cybersecurity company, an Israeli cybersecurity company, and its malware, spyware, Pegasus, we worked with activists, researchers, and lawyers around the world to map, again for the first time, a landscape of global surveillance. And what's important here is to make a connection between digital surveillance and physical violence on the ground. So these cases, I hope, illustrate not only a variety in the approaches, but also the importance, number one, of beginning to think about how technology can be equipped by civil society, the importance of collaborative networks. That's something I want to emphasize again. That's something that not any one society has to do on their own, but solidarity from international civil society allies can do. And that is when we can begin to get closer to truth and therefore a better and just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Omar. I think it's fascinating to see how digital tools and digital technologies can really be used to see human rights violations and depict war crimes and airstrikes. We'll come back to that in a bit, but I think a conversation about the future is not just limited to governance and digital technologies, but we must shed light on energy. And I think the energy sector in our region is really facing many challenges. Increased demand, a weak grid, expensive electricity, and mostly like heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So what role do you think, Jessica, does renewable energy play in power generation and energy security?
It's very difficult to go after all these colleagues today. So I don't want us to look at renewable energy as a sole provider of energy that's clean, sustainable, green. But I also want us to look at renewable energy from a point of security enhancement and economic prosperity, which we definitely need in the region. So when we look into all these challenges, and now I need to step a bit into the past and the current status of the energy, and all the challenges you've mentioned, we have a lack of investments that's so heavy in the power generation. And we witness it every day. We have blackouts across most of the countries, except for Jordan, it's like tiny a little bit. And we do have expensive electricity, and people witness that. And sometimes we hear that it costs X dollars per kilowatt hour or cents per kilowatt hour. And you cannot just look at the cost of electricity from just a figure perspective. We have to compare it. How much is it from a household income? And then we see that it's a very expensive electricity, whether it's in Palestine or Jordan or Lebanon. It's mostly a lot more subsidized in Syria, but then they're relying on diesel generators as well. So it's a very expensive electricity. So the affordability factor needs to be in place as well. And then we look at the security. So if you do not have energy security, then your national security is compromised. And then in terms of security, we find that in Lebanon and in Jordan, they have a very high dependence on fossil fuel imports. In Lebanon, it crosses 92%, so you're highly dependent on these foreign countries and foreign suppliers where you're importing your fuel from. In Palestine, it's even worse. You're importing 100% of your electricity in the West Bank from Israel Electricity Company, half of your electricity import in Gaza as well. You're highly dependent on Israel, and we witness it every time there's an escalation of conflict. Citizens have to stay without power. And then we step into Syria, and because of all the damage of the infrastructure, and you have restrictions on hydrocarbon production, on imports, and damages to the infrastructure, we find that also a lot, even if they do have access to fossil fuels or a power plant nearby, they're living in a blackout or have to depend on diesel. So the national security is compromised. And here where we insert the role of renewable energy. It's supposed to make these countries better in the future, because when we look at the affordability factor, renewable energy is a lot cheaper in so many cases in the world. And then in the case of Palestine and Syria, you can localize your power generation. You can have your power plant in a mini-grid right near in your neighborhood or your village or your town or your rooftop. So you have your electricity produced on your premise. You don't have to go through all the heavy logistics of getting the imports of fossil fuel into a restricted area in Syria or to go through Israel and Palestine. In the case of Lebanon, we also have a huge problem, which has been that no reforms in the power sector have happened in the past 30 years, which is a huge. It's mostly because of the bottlenecks in politics. But distributed renewable energy can offer a way to bypass all these bottlenecks because it doesn't go through central government, and everything that goes through central government in Lebanon is subject to all the political bickering. So if we look into all of this, in Jordan, there's also a high dependence on fossil fuels. If you speak to any business, they will list in their top 3 barriers to doing business the cost of electricity. So installing electricity for the commercial sector, for the industrial sector, renewable energy would be very beneficial. So this is why renewable energy is very important. It's affordability, increasing your security. And then we get to the point that we haven't managed to attract investments in the power sector in all these countries. If we look into the MENA region, there have been heavy investments in power production, at least. So we see that investment, there are at least 7% the average of annual growth in power generation. But this is not reflected in the Levant, at least not in Jordan, not in Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. It's a bit better in Jordan. But investments in the power grid are even worse for the entire MENA region. So we have weak investments in the grid. But when we look into renewable energy, we find now that whether it's finance institutions, climate funds, sovereign wealth fund, they're looking into more renewable energy investments. So we need to seize this chance. How are we going to get all these investments to improve our power production in the region? And we can tap into all these funds, and we have to do that. So from this perspective, it's not just about providing clean, sustainable electricity. It's about fixing the economy for the future and providing better security.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we often talk about government and we talk about economy, but a very important aspect is overlooked, and it is culture. And here I would like to turn to Ms. Valentina Qassisieh to tell us a little bit, what is the status of culture nowadays in our region, and what are the challenges facing our culture in the future?
Okay. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. As you mentioned, this is a very important topic that is always being neglected, especially in our region. If we just look at it, why culture is important, it's because it is a major component of shaping our identity and who we are. And also culture helps us overcome all these challenges. We're talking mental health, whether from Corona point of view, the COVID, what we went through, or in our region, all the challenges that we are facing. It is very important to be engaged in cultural activities, to have culture accessible, so that it can help us be able to survive what we're going through. And so it's all about our beliefs, our customs, our traditions, our even religious beliefs. It's our way of life, our way of thinking, even our architecture, and what comes out of artistic and literary production. Our region used to be the cradle of civilizations. As everybody knows, Aleppo was the first kingdom in the world. Jericho in Palestine was the oldest city, or is known to be the oldest city in the world, like 9,000 years old. So we have a lot of culture, but it's all left out. Everything is being not considered, that we have a very rich history, very rich cultural heritage, but we are not taking this into consideration. We are, since a very long time, we have neglected culture due to, first of all, financial constraints. We all know that we are very, we're suffering, whether Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, or Palestine, we're suffering from financial problems. So the first thing the government would do, okay, let's remove the budget from the culture budget. Second, is it essential? Well, it doesn't bring money to the economy, so let's not give it a priority as this sector. Yet it is very important, because cultural and creative industries do bring income, but no one has calculated that. If you look at our education system, we removed culture, especially in Jordan. I can say in Jordan, and I'm sure also in other countries. And we're not talking here about the private schools, the high-end private schools. I'm talking here about the public schools that are the most, where almost 99% of individuals go to. Culture is not essential. First of all, we don't have teachers. Second, in certain areas religiously, culture is not, teachers feel that this is something they don't want to delve in, because this is against their religious beliefs, and so let's remove culture away and not, so the class that you see on the curriculum, that there is a class for culture or arts, etc., it's changed into something else. I can talk about Jordan. We have given our education system and Ministry of Education to the Muslim Brotherhood. So definitely culture inside the schools has been, since the 70s, have been slashed from the curriculum. Also, if we look at financially, if we want to have access to culture, people cannot afford to attend concerts or to be part of art, or only elite, or it would be concentrated inside the main city or the capital. So the other areas, the cities, they don't have access to arts and culture, which is as I mentioned, it's very important for our mental health and well-being. So unfortunately, we are in that phase. Yet, as you heard this morning, and now we're talking about artificial intelligence, it looks like we're going to become robots. We need to be human beings, okay? So it is essential that we are all be engaged in arts and culture. We need to stay compassionate with artificial intelligence, and robotics and all of this and AI. I don't think we will lose our human touch and connectivity, and this is very essential. So it is very important that not just governments, but even individuals look at it as not as luxury. It's a right, like right for education is a right, culture and access to culture is a right, and not only for the elite, it's for everyone, and it should be accessible to everyone. If we look now, I was going through some what's happening in, for example, Syria. Although they have the war, but still culture was used as a form of expression. So graffiti. Today we heard about what using films. This is very important to express your feelings, whether positive or negative. You need to have also, how do you say it? I forgot the word, but to be able also, you need critical thinking skills. This you get from reading, from getting exposed to debates, discussions, etc. So all components of culture, like cinema, theater, music, of course, literary reading and competitions, all of these would enhance your critical thinking skills. Plus, for children, it's very important for math, the math skills. Music, you look at it, what is music? It is math. All the children who are exposed to cultural activities, they do better in their education. So maybe this is why we are not getting better in our education in the region, is that we removed essential component from our education system. So we have to return it. Whether I'm not just talking about Jordan, I'm talking about our region, and not just Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, but it's mostly in all of our region. Lebanon has always been a hub for culture, and everyone from all over the world would come to whether attend concerts or be part of making culture in Lebanon. But now with the crisis, where is it? No one is talking about all these important issues. Syria also used to have a lot of activities. I remember when we were children, we used to go a lot to Syria, and the book fair, the International Book Fair, it was one of the most important book fairs. I know there is control from the government. It's not just in Syria, it's in Jordan, it's in Palestine, everywhere. The government, unfortunately, feels that they have the right to produce culture. Although the role should be to facilitate culture, not produce it. So this is a little bit, because I saw you looking at me. No, I can still continue. Okay.
You still have time.
I came from the field of community empowerment, child protection. And I always thought, what is this culture? It's always, this is a luxury. Should we look at people like having something to eat on the table, or first to be active in cultural activities? And I was so wrong. I say it because I've seen the impact of a cultural access to culture on different individuals, whether children, adults. even those who have, we call them the elders, how important it is to feel that they are part of something, they are connected. Many feel that they are left out, and they are left out, especially those who are not from the elite or from the capital, because they don't have these activities and access to music. The minute you introduce such activities, at the beginning it would be, no, this is not what we want, but then everyone wants to be part of something. In our region, we keep saying, Arabs do not read, Arabs do not read. And there is a study from the ESQA saying that we read 6 pages a year. This is how much Arabs would read. And actually, if you look at, we don't have proper public libraries. Schools, they don't have good libraries, and the librarian at the schools would be sitting waiting for a child to come inside the library to ask for a book, and sometimes school would say, no, you can't take the book, because if it's lost, then I will be judged for that book, or I have to pay back for that book. So the library is a very nice location that you can look at it like window shopping, but not be part of it. And this is why we are not reading. But when you start establishing libraries, having these accessible to all, plus being a hub for culture and a safe place, this is where you will see that everyone will be more engaged in reading. Reading enhances well-being, enhances your critical thinking skills, also learning more about opening your horizon and imagination, and learning about different cultures, etc. And this is something, maybe because it helps you becoming a thinker or critical thinker, the governments do not want to support culture. And this is something is always debatable. No, why are they fighting cultural activities? Well, if you're thinking, if you're being part of debating, then you are making it hard for our state and governments in our region. So this is unfortunately our scene in the culture, or our cultural scene in our region. Yet, I am someone who is very hopeful. And since I joined this field 10 years ago, I saw tremendous transformation. Even now with AI, you can see now AI is being used for music. People are going for social media to have access to different programs and activities. When there is war in Syria, Lebanon, many went, like in Lebanon, when you had the port explosion, many lost their spaces. So they went online, like virtual museums, and in music it went online. Artists are going online and collaborating. We have, of course, the ebooks and the audiobooks, and with all of this. So I am very hopeful, and since I joined that sector, I am much more happier. And I can tell everyone, this is the sector you should be in. It brings happiness and joy to you.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned the importance of music, arts, thought leadership. So I have a follow-up question for you on that. Looking at the future, how do you think we can integrate this in our educational systems in the region? And my second question would be, could you shed a bit of light about social innovations in the region, the future of social innovations, and how can that, and how's that looking if we're looking at the future?
adding arts and culture in our education system needs a lot of lobbying from individuals who are in the sector and individuals who care about their children. So families need to understand that we need culture, arts and culture in our schools, and this requires a lot of lobbying and follow-up. On the other hand, also, as you mentioned, social innovations, they would help in getting, it doesn't have to be directly from schools if we couldn't or if it takes time. Nothing is easy. We all know that. It takes time. For example, artists or musicians who learn and saw that we need to get education, music into the education system, but we are not able to do it because you need a lot of resources, you need a lot of money. So they created something called ASF. It's a platform where you can teach music to children through your mobile or your computer, and you just log into it, and slowly you get to access to learn how to play music. Same thing as in reading. There are some platforms that helps you start level reading, especially children nowadays. They like to use English instead of Arabic in their dealings and talks, etc. And unfortunately, Arabic is becoming very weak among the young, and parents are very upset is that our schools are not helping our children with Arabic. So there are now platforms that you can log into it, and it's leveled. So there is leveled reading for children from, let's say, 3 to 6, 6 to 14, etc., to help you. And there are other platforms through games and fun for younger children, like singing, so that they can learn the alphabets, the colors, etc. So this is how you can link social innovation with culture. And it is important, like social innovation helps, first of all, promote the arts and culture. It helps create employment and economic opportunities. And you can be anywhere and develop that. I can be, let's say in the US and access this platform, especially the Arabs who feel that they want their children to learn Arabic and they don't know how to do it. So there are some activities, especially also you want to maintain the cultural heritage and for your children, and through documentation and platforms and social innovation, you can maintain this connection and keep it.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Speaking of innovation, I'd like to come back to you, Jessica, and ask, do you see renewable energy as a driver for innovation and entrepreneurship in our region?
Yeah, absolutely. A few years ago, I've done some piece of work on how politics has defeated any renewable energy technology disruption on a large scale in the region. I do believe that in a few years, I would have a revised edition, which would be what would defeat politics, and it would be youth and entrepreneurship. And that's because if we look into the youth share of the population in the region, it's actually a very large, it's the highest segment of the population. Sadly, it suffers from high unemployment level, and that could be a major destabilizing factor, further destabilizing factor in the region, which governments are not accounting for. However, we've seen trends from prior to the pandemic that immigration has become more and more restricted, and then so it would create more entrepreneurship based on needs. But because of the pandemic, we've seen an acceleration of remote work, more entrepreneurship, more people, young people focusing on having better life prospects, better work-life balance, thinking of starting something, and that's going to accelerate entrepreneurship, in my belief, in the region in the near future. And here's the role of renewable energy. Renewable energy can be deployed on different models. It doesn't have to be just large scale, which is dominant in the region. Distributed energy could be and has a high potential in the region, but it could also be a huge potential for entrepreneurship because it's cross-sectorial. So you need it in agriculture, you need it in water, you need it for energy, you need it in industry. So all these different models could be developed, and we have the youth potential, and we do have educated youth, and we do have access to the internet and access to the outer world, so you can scale this. But then there are barriers that need to be mitigated. And in my opinion, one of the key barriers is cultural, which is we are in a region that considers failure as a taboo. You're not supposed to fail, and it penalizes you. So it's a high cost to start a business, to go bankrupt and close a business, and then if you're failure, your family is ashamed of you. Your close friends are ashamed of saying you're a failure. Although failure is a necessary step of every journey, whether it's in a business and entrepreneurship and others. So we need to actually look at failure from a different perspective and encourage it. If you fail the first day in your first venture, you might go second, third, but you're going to get there. So you need enthusiasm, but you also need the culture to be there, and financing mechanisms, and to also decrease that cost of starting a startup. We also do not have a setup for starting a social entrepreneurship, for example. So you go and start a regular business and you pay the high fees. So we need to remove these barriers to make this happen.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we can all agree this has been a very exhilarating discussion. Before we move to Q&A, I just have one last question to both Amr and Omar. What do you think are the challenges to integrating artificial intelligence and digital technologies in our region in the future? I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. So the main challenges are, first, we need to reform the education system, have a clear vision of what to do with AI. Countries are doing this, the EU is doing this. Countries in the region, mainly the Gulf, are also defining their AI strategies. We have also a lack of investment in the infrastructure. Entrepreneurship environment is missing. We also have a big obstacle that is the authoritarian regime in place. We need legal reforms and so on. I just can give you one concrete example. So earlier this year, the Syrian government promulgated a law that looks like the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. This law says what are the punishment for spyware, spam, phishing, all these kind of things. Still, in the same law, what they did is they also added articles about what will happen to you if you criticize the financial and economic performance of the state online. You can go up to 5 years in prison, I think. What is the penalty of trying to change the constitution illegally online? I mean, how can you change the constitution illegally online? I don't know, but you can go to 15 years of prison. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm just saying what I know. Maybe if you look it up, you have different terminology. So we also need this kind of, platform that we can build on top of it. This is a legal platform, economic platform, an ecosystem that is missing. We have the human capacity, but we have almost everything else missing.
Thank you, Amr. Amr, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just add that as a practice that's primarily based on building up civil society, the challenge is that you're working completely on a grassroots level in a place that has a lot of other challenges, right? So how do you begin to train students that are studying architecture or computer engineering or software engineering to also repurpose their skills for investigating worldwide or locally what corporations or states are doing wrong? But I think the hope at the same time, if I'll just add, is that it also anonymizes, decentralizes, and democratizes the establishment of truth of these civilian investigations, which I think opens up even repressive areas to do this kind of work.
Thank you, Omar. Let's give a round of applause for our panel. We have a lot of exciting questions from the audience to all of you. So I'll start with the first one to you, Omar. Could your methods be used to investigate the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh?
Yes. And in fact, you'll see that if you pay attention in the news in the next little while, this kind of investigation using open source techniques has been growing a lot faster. So it began as civilian agencies or research groups. Now the New York Times has a visual investigations department, right? So you're going to see a lot of these kinds of attempts to do these same investigations. We're going to also be looking at it. And that for me is a hopeful thing, yeah.
We have another question from Emily. Would you like to ask the question, or would you like me to read it?
I don't mind. I'm happy to ask it.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm not sure who to direct it to, so I'll direct it to everyone. I'm wondering what role that you afford to accountability for past human rights abuses and international crimes that have been committed previously or are still ongoing. For example, the international crimes against humanity being committed by Israel against Palestinians, including the crime of apartheid, the serious human rights abuses committed by Assad's regime, and also accountability for the Beirut blast. So I just wanted to hear from all of you, or one of you, about what role do you think accountability plays for ensuring a prosperous future for the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Who would like to take that first?
I feel attacked. So I think, really quickly, I think there's no time frame that determines what we investigate, or any of you investigate, especially as anyone here can pick up and begin to do this work, very important work. I think each of these things you've mentioned, we ourselves are interested in, other groups are interested in, and will continue working on. So whether historical or that's something that just happened.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add anything?
Just a little bit under arts and culture, many have been documenting all of these violations and taking many to courts, international courts. But it also depends on who the US is supporting, and it depends. So if it comes to between Israel and Palestine, it's always the side of Israel. And I need to mention is that we all know, and we saw the videos of the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. We don't need AI, but anyway, this is an additional proof. But it's with art, under the field of arts and culture, a lot have been documented, whether in books, whether in videos, whether in photography, etc. But God is great.
We have another question from Ali Dahir.
Yeah, I guess my question is about the reconstruction of the forensic landscapes. It's very interesting, but one question is I was wondering about the engineering caliber and the expertise caliber that's required to conduct such reconstruction, and if possible, what happens if such reconstruction was utilized to impose a wrong narrative? Like in the very simplistic case of the reporter Shireen, I'm envisioning a case, for instance, Israeli authorities conduct their own implementation of this forensic landscape to prove that, for instance, Shireen was indeed shot by random fire. How do you ensure that this does not turn into the other outlets, such as media, or for instance, the investigations that the apartheid is trying to conduct, where misinformation is going to be propagated?
Yeah, first, the trouble of civilian investigations is we always have lesser tools and lesser access to the crimes being committed, right? That's why we need collaborative networks. So if a state like Israel releases a video that's animating how it wasn't their fault, we can very easily, anyone here and teams can just test that. And that's the power, I think, of civilian investigations, that if they had resources that they use, we simply have a right to ask, well, give us that material and we'll look at it ourselves. That goes back to the question of accountability. Before, and that's why I also mentioned both state and corporate accountability in one, is that the monopoly of narrative means that if they have an absolute statement about what happened, we have no other way to test it. So I think now, no matter how they make the claim, whether through a statement or a video, we can always hopefully use whatever skills we have to do that. There's no definition of an level of expertise, right? So in our case, we're a multidisciplinary group, but we also want to spread this out. I don't believe in one agency doing this. I believe in, and I believe everyone in our group does, that this should be disseminated amongst all civilians as a crowdsourced evidence creation. So whatever capacity you have, you can apply it. Whatever expertise you have, you can apply it. That's why we work from journalists to artists to architects working on the same cases together.
Thank you, Amr. We have another question from Leila Khanfar. It's for Jessica.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, how do you envision the roadmap to a decarbonized and sustainable economy in the region, especially with the presence of the Israeli state, so-called state? And where do you think we stand with regards to the Paris Agreement, if we should be held accountable for it at all? And following on that, how do we solve the energy trilemma in the region without resorting to Western institutions and funds?
Sorry, can you repeat the last
one? The last one?
What?
The last one is about the energy trilemma. How do we solve it without resorting to the Western institutions and funds?
Where we stand, let me start by if we're accountable for the Paris Agreement. I think we all have to do our share in reducing our emissions because, well, it's impacting all of us. Even if it's not fully our responsibility and there are bigger emitters than others, it is impacting my life. It is impacting your life. It's impacting not just the environment, but also your health. So we all need to do our part, and I think it's a collective thing, not just for government, but also for individuals. It's a very long way from where we stand in the region, considering that we still have today, we have a huge dependence on fossil fuels, on imports, and then we need different steps to get there to decarbonize the economy. One of them is having adequate policies, which is not in place, the investments, government and political will, which is also not there. And here we find a huge conflict of interest with the fuel economy. Even in countries in the region, in the Levant, where we're not producing, in countries that are not producing any hydrocarbons, they're still highly invested and have vested interest in the fossil fuel economy because mostly of corruption and so. So that's one thing. We need institutions and strong institutions and public institutions to do all this work, and dedicated institutions that also do not have conflict of interest on their agendas. If you have a ministry that's dealing with fossil fuels and the same ministry is supposed to be pushing forward renewable energy, then we do notice that renewable energy is falling down on the priority agenda. So we need all these factors to be in place. It's not easy getting there, but we need to start somewhere. The share is still very small, like in Palestine, it's 1%. In Lebanon, it's 7%, but if I do remove the hydropower plants that have been there for so many years, and it's 2%. The biggest effort has been done in Jordan, but now in Jordan, they're facing a huge bottlenecks, and that's mostly because the other things that we need to account for, they added a lot of renewable energy, and they added at the same time a lot of thermal generation. And because of lack of accountability and lack of adequate policy and lack of strong institutions, they ended up with expensive power being purchased from all these different contracts, whether it's renewable energy or fossil fuels. So you also need to secure good value for money. And this is very important in moving forward. If you want to add renewable energy, you need to add it at the least cost. And you need to do that for all kind of power production. And then how we're going to reduce dependence on Western institutions, where I think that's going to be a bit more difficult because you need investments to come from a place or the other. Then if we want to reduce any kind of dependence on whether it's aid or investment from any kind of foreign institution, then what the governments need to do is provide an enabling environment to attract investments and private sector investments. And then you need to reduce political threats, economic threats, improve macroeconomic prospects, but above all, you need to have good governance and good regulation, because any investor that's pledging money wants to make sure that the government first is not going to change their mind overnight, and the contract is still going to be there. And two, that if anything goes wrong, that there's a third party or an entity, legal entity, that they can resort to and make sure that they're actually going to get their right. And third, that it's not going to be high corruption media. I know it's very difficult, but step by step.
Thank you, Jessica. I think, Layla, you have also another question for Valentina.
My question is about art as a form of resistance, especially in our region, and how do you think it contributes to reforming political regimes in the region? Political regimes, if it can reform them or change them by any way.
Definitely arts is a tool for expression, whether in all forms, activism. If you look at many graffiti, it is part of the expression against, some are against different regimes. Banksy, for example, in Palestine, he has many graffiti that is of expression. How would it affect the regimes? Definitely they fear arts and culture, definitely. It depends on which, how do you use it? How are you acting upon it? I can tell you in Jordan, no, it is important for us. We have, how to say it, in the newspaper when you do the caricature. They look at it, let's say, not just as the regimes, but I'm talking about if it was about a government, or it was about a minister, or if it was about an entity. There are always characters about things, and they consider it as a way of activism. And whoever, let's say, if it was about me as a minister, I would also look at it and would consider, oh, something is happening. I need to look at it. I'm not saying it would remove authoritarian regimes, but it is an expression that everybody can look at and feel that, okay, this is a way that we are expressing what we feel when we are unable to say it in public or say it in discussions or anything. When you have graffiti or you have videos or you have films, definitely it shed lights on what is happening.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, we'll be taking 3 more questions, two of which are also for Valentina. There is one from Uday, and there's one from Wahiba. We'll start with Wahiba.
Thank you. I'm not going to stand. I'm so tall. So I mean, we do understand that it's very important for us to embrace our culture again, and I do agree with you that not just religion, actually, it's also politics that has been facing this always. Like, for example, as you said in the cultural, like they tell us about, you know, just political people instead of teaching us about our culture. So this is an example. But now we're facing another thing, which is in the Arab world, we have to also adapt and integrate with the new culture, with the new values. And for me personally, I see them valid values like feminism, like LGBTQ acceptance. These values that everyone on the earth need them. For example, freedom of speech. Like, I mean, when you spoke about art, we know people who wrote just silly sketches in Spotlight in Syria. They were still in prison, and we don't know if they are alive or not. So freedom of speech, LGBTQ society, feminism, these new values, we also need to adopt them. Do you think this, adopt them? Do you think this is an obstacle, or do you think it's going to affect our embracing our culture again? Is it going to affect, is the embracing of new values affect our culture negatively or positively? How do you think these two things can be, you know, done together at the same time?
But these are not new values. These are already our values. They are our values. When you're saying freedom of expression, look at our history. There was always expressions everywhere. If you look even from thousands of years, if you look on walls, on the inscriptions, so these are not something new. For me, these are values that we all believe in. Some are not seeing it as important values. Doesn't mean that all of us, we don't see it. Don't you believe in human rights? Don't you believe in, we all believe in this, and it's not new for us. This is not something new for us. It has always been our culture. If you look at the writings, the literature from our ancestors, it always talked about human rights. So it's not new, these are not new values. If you're talking about using them and, or showing them, or maybe abide by them, and it's negative, no, it's not negative. We all believe in human rights, whether in our region, whether in Ukraine, whether in Europe, we believe in all of that. Feminism, we all believe in it. It's the way you interpret it. We do believe in it. I come from a family where we believe in it, yeah, but my family did not come alone. We do believe in it in certain, every family from a certain extent. It doesn't mean we don't believe in it. It's, we need, as I told you, we gave our education system away. So raising our children in the proper way, what is the values now are the new values. The previous values were much better than what we have now. And that's why we need to go back to our school system. That's why we need the parents to fight for their children to have arts and culture in the schools. Critical thinking. You have a mind, you can use it. It's not just, now our education system is memorize, don't use your mind, that's it. This is how it is. And we need critical thinking through different forms. And once our children are more engaged in critical thinking, more engaged in our culture and arts, you will see a big transformation and adoption, or not adoption, I mean expression of what we all believe in.
Thank you, Valentina. I think your answer is a nice leeway into Uday's question.
Thank you so much, Valentina. Very quickly, if we look through history, our culture is always changing. There is no culture that stayed for thousands of years. 500 years, 300 years, 200 years. So culture is changing, and it will change in the future. Do you think the problem this time in this change that we're witnessing, it's more, it's not organic, it's not coming from inside, this change in culture? like 1,000 year or 100 year, but right now it's more influenced by the Western modernity, or it's more by the social media, where right now the change is we want to speak English, all of us. We want to wear the same things. And do you see this kind of change? The problem of it is that it's more like becoming Western rather than having our own change.
How many civilizations came to our region?
I can't count them.
Exactly, a lot. And each one came with, they all wanted to capture our region. They all want to change us. They all wanted to, so we keep, and culture keeps adapting to what's happening. Life changes. So it is, how do you say it? It stays alive and adaptive to what is happening. Yes, we are a lot looking like, let's say, Europeans or Westerns. It's not bad, is it? Is it a problem? It's what's inside. It's what's here and your heart. It's not, and this is something you gain and you adapt, and it becomes part of you. So it's not negative or it's not positive. It is what is happening in the world all the time.
Thank you.
Can I have a question?
We'll take the last two questions as we need to wrap up. We can have your question, and then we also have a question here.
All right, so regarding arts and culture, so how can we, to what extent can we measure the social value created by culture and arts in our life? How we can measure the social value and the cultural value created by arts and culture?
This is a very, very, very hard question. And we always say measuring, and impact. It's not easy. And it takes a long time to measure it. It takes decades, actually. And just seeing children that are able to read or reading more, or you have more artists, you have more publications, you have more access, I think that's enough. You don't have to calculate it.
We have our last question here.
Actually, it's a notice, it's not a question. I'm totally agree with your explanation, but it's really a matter of civilization, and you have your own civilization. So you have your own values before any other coming civilizations to the area. That's right, and that's absolutely right. So, thank you. So, your values is not able to be developed, or we consider it an evolution line or something like that.
But
you
values
have
do
your own
add
values.
to it.
Yes, I do agree with you, but this is another side or another side of explanation. So you can develop, as I said, your values. You can build on it. You cannot develop, because if you want to develop, you want something new. Even if you pass by any other civilization and they have some good values, manners, whatever, so you can gain some of these. But it's a matter, or it's based on your society and based on your own civilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all for being with us today, and for the panelists for this exhilarating discussion. With this, I will invite Amir, our chair, to give his concluding remarks. Thank you, everyone.
It has been a long day, so I'm going to try my best to be as brief as possible. But it has been really a pleasure to see all of you here. I mean, all of us can agree the situation we are in for our region is not optimal, for the lack of better words. But we also seen that through all these stories that we've heard on the past panel, from these cities that we had, how change and how things were actually quite different, and that there are cycles that come and goes that brings better hope for our region. And we also got inspired by some of the stories and the technologies that we could put at people's hands to bring about justice and to speak truth to power, like empowering civil society, in new mediums of innovation like fintech and cryptocurrency that could enable middle-class people to protect their savings and grow their wealth, give them more freedom and stability. And also, a lot of the technologies that we have can disseminate culture that can actually empower, music that brings hope and gives courage to people, and poetry, as we've heard from Tamim as well. I really hope that this conference gave you a little bit of hope that we could actually move in the right direction and that we can do something about the state of dysfunction that we're in. And I really hope that this conference also spark a tiny bit of action, because it's really important, because we can talk forever, but if we don't do something about it, we can't bring change. I want to thank all the organizing committee members whom without this would have been possible. I want to thank Jumana, Uday, Leen, Melanie, and Abdullah. And I want to thank the advisory board from the Saïd Foundation to the Rhodes Trust. And I want to especially thank the Rhodes Trust team, Georgie and Sorina, who has been the heroes behind the scene. And I want to thank you also for coming. I wish you a wonderful evening.